Hi, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to our second Scholars in the Square lecture of 2025. Hello to those of you, of course, in the room, and those of you who are with us on Zoom and YouTube. For those of you who are new to the format, the plan is that Shubham will offer a 20-minute public presentation, and then he's going to engage in a 20-minute conversation with Dr. Catherine Young, an associate fellow at the CSRS, a retired professor from McGill University, and someone whose work in Indian religions will be well known to everybody in the scholarly community that I've ever met and will ever likely meet. After Shubham and Catherine talk for about 20 minutes, I'll chair a 20-minute open conversation. So our speaker today is Shubham Arora, a graduate student fellow at the CSRS and a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia. Prior to starting his PhD at UBC's Asian Studies Department under the supervision of Adish Satyed, and hello Adish if you're watching, he completed an MA in Buddhist Studies, Philosophy, and Comparative Religion at Nalanda University in India. Prior to that, he completed a degree in Computer Science and Engineering. While the shift, I know, many of you said, what? I know. While the shift from computer science to religious studies must have shocked his parents, I can assure them that his friends and peers here are deeply grateful that Shubham decided to commit himself to understanding the place of eroticism in ancient Sanskrit texts. Now, in a famous essay by Audre Lorde, she argues that thinking carefully about our erotic human entanglements shows us that such energies are not present only in sexual encounters. Instead, she sees in the experience and metaphor of the erotic precisely what animates our drive to do anything, to be in relationship with anybody, and to change the world in any way. And so with that basic interest in world changing in mind, before I step aside, I want to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanish peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. So please join me in thanking and welcoming Shubham Arora.
Thank you so much, Paul, for this extremely generous introduction, I would say. Thank you, CSRS, Rachel, Paul, Scott, Nariko, for having me here, for giving me a place in their lives. And most importantly, remember this, office space in their department or center where I can just relax and think about sexual pleasure all day, every day, and that's what I do. And I'm really glad that you are all here. That means how much we need pleasure in our life and how much we want it. So thanks to you all. But I'm afraid to tell you that I'm not an expert on pleasure. I'm an expert on Sanskrit, and I'm an expert on making pleasure boring for you. Because I have read it too much. I don't feel it, I think, anymore. So sometimes it's a nightmare for me too. I'm honest, Rachel. If you're laughing, I'm honest. And that's what happens, like what has been researching for all these years. And I don't know what I'm researching. I think I'm thinking about sexual pleasure all day, every day, and here I am. So when I say I work on erotic pleasure, what do I mean by that? I study, I read, I analyze texts written in Sanskrit language on erotics, on various ways on how to have sexual intimacy, how to perform, how to have interpersonal relations in order to communicate your desires, in order to feel seen and be seen by your partner. And it's rather an entire genre in Sanskrit literature, I would say, an authoritative and ideological genre. Remember all these nitty-gritty details because I'm going to ask you tomorrow. So it's rather an entire genre of writing in Sanskrit literature, an authoritative and ideological one known as Kama Shastra. Kama Shastra, that we may translate as theory of erotics. Now, time for some Sanskrit. So Kama Shastra is made up of two words. Kama means love, desire, sexual pleasure, eros. And Shastra means instruction, a didactic text or system of ideas, a book of authoritative rules. Now, Brian will ask me, and I'm just making up this, Brian. So Brian will ask me, Shubham, tell me who needs a text on sexual pleasure? And that's a very legitimate question, Brian. Thank you so much for that. However rhetorical it may sound, but scholars back in pre-modern South Asia, they thought it's a need. Why? Because pleasure doesn't happen to everybody. And every individual experiences pleasure in so many different ways. And I have learned it myself for a very hard way, I would say. So yeah. And I would say these scholars or these authors in pre-modern South Asia, they were coming up with taxonomies and practices and accoutrements and rules on how to present yourself, how to see other person, and at the same time, how to communicate your desire, as I said in the beginning. And one learns various methods of performing pleasure, experiencing pleasure through the genre of the text called Kama Shastra, so the theory of erotics. Now, I haven't come across any formal definition of this genre, Kama Shastra, but this is this is how I describe in my dissertation based on my literature review. So I'll just go over it briefly. So the theory of erotics delineates ideological and authoritative taxonomies through which to understand sexuality and desire. It codifies rules and norms of interpersonal amorous behavior. And finally, it prescribes a diverse range of affective practices. Affective is now my keyword for a very long time. Affective practices and accoutrements for the pursuit of pleasure. Now, a disclaimer. Kama Shastra or theory of erotics is not pornography. If this is something you are coming up for, it's not pornography, it's not anthology of sex stories. It's also not about sex positions, or it's not always illustrated. Quite the contrary, the text looks like that, which is in the background. So I would say it's a scholarly text, it's an argumentative work, it's an affective regime that prepares your body to experience pleasure, to cultivate aesthetic refinements, to prepare your body how to act not just in bed, but in the society at large. So, and these aspects of this classical genre of Kama Shastra makes it a significant aspect of courtly culture, urban lifestyle, and cosmopolitanism in first millennium of South Asia. Let's get back to this slide for once. You see the triangle in the corner, three aims of human life. It's an ideology, I would say, especially in a Brahmanical tradition. There are three elements or three aims that humans should strive for or achieve: dharma, artha, and kama. If these goals are, I'll explain what these are, but if these goals are in conflict, then you have to prioritize dharma and then artha and then kama. Now, what the heck these dharma, artha, kama, Shubham? So dharma is customary practices, or you can translate it as morality, like ethical way of living a life. It has concerns about purity and pollution, anxiety against pollution. Artha is all about how you accumulate power and wealth and treasure, and how you govern a country, how things should be, how things should not act, how to fight. And kama is all about how to pursue pleasure. So it's an ideology, and the Kama Sutra. Now I'm giving you all these terms. Kama Shastra is the genre, and Kama Sutra is the oldest available text we have. So Kama Sutra and any words? Kama Shastra. Excellent. But Kama Sutra is not the only text in this genre. There are multiple texts, I would say. I know you can't see, even I can't see. It's an overwhelmingly populated slide, I would say. But this trajectory of Kama Shastra has over, I would say, 100 texts. Most of them are lost, sadly. Some of them are in the archives, digitized, undigitized equally, not published for sure. And when I was doing my archival research across India and Nepal, I have found so many lost fragmentary texts of the Kama Shastra genre that are like pieces of the puzzle, and they are spread across, and you don't know how to make sense of it because you don't know anything about the author, you don't know the date. So how to make sense of these texts? Now, that's a question that other scholars are also struggling, and I'm also going to struggle myself. Like, try to make life easy if you can, but because that's what all about pleasure is. So the question I asked myself, and I was going through all these texts, like why there are so many texts and what they are doing differently. Means is one text not enough to think about pleasure and to perform if it's all about performance? And what are these authors trying to achieve in their text? When are they engaging with this idea of karma, pleasure? What are they trying to influence? And what are their intellection? What new intellectual contribution they are doing to this Sanskrit intellectual culture that I would say. So in Sanskrit intellectual culture, now I've given you a very heavy term. So in Sanskrit intellectual culture, there are different domains of knowledge, like grammar, like politics, like law, like morality, dharma, like artha, like justice, like logic. And so the theory of erotics is one such like text. Now, Shubham, what does your project do differently? So I thought, why don't we do an intellectual history of this tradition? So scholars so far have studied or approached the text. I would say only one text so far, like the Kama Sutra is the highly scrutinized text, whereas later texts are less studied. Okay, so, and they have approached these texts in a manner that they do the textual analysis, I mean critical edition, and they have approached through historical ways like studying the social, cultural, religious history through these texts, particularly the Kama Sutra, and critical studies approach like feminist perspective or queer perspective, trans perspective, and also Foucauldian lens, of course. How can we forget that? But I thought, why don't we question these authors in terms of their voices, like finding those voices in the text. When I see, for example, a text here, what do I see? I don't see a text written by a single author. It's a process of, it's a discursive process where multiple authors are coming and they are discussing one text. So identifying the voices of the author and then contextualizing the voice in that manner to understand what cultural forces, what social forces, what religious forces were at play, and how can we know about the society better? So how society is influencing these authors in order to write their text accordingly. At the same time, how the text written by this scholar is influencing the society, and most importantly, this tradition of Kama Shastra. So until I would say 2011, no such systematic study has been done. But after 2011, scholars have taken a serious interest in rethinking the history of this entire tradition, like why it's still an important tradition for people to study if we have these many texts available. So it has to be something significant about it. So how this karma world affecting poetics, how this karma world affecting aesthetics, ornamentation. So these are the things that we scholars are trying to achieve, and my project in a way contributes to that. Now, speaking of contextualizing the voices, I'll talk about oral sex. I know that's a fascinating topic, and I would not talk about in detail, but I'll give you. So in the Kama Sutra, there are 7 books. The second book is dedicated to sex, all the sexual practices from typology, embracing, kissing, and so on and so forth. The 9th chapter in the second book of the Kama Sutra is oral sex. And in that chapter, if you see the last table, the author, whose name is Vatsyayana begins the text by taxonomizing 2 types of third nature. Now you will ask me, Shubham, what is a third nature? I would say third nature is the category that we see in contemporary terms as queer. So male, female, and the third nature is the queer category. So this practice is primarily for the queer people, or rather I should say third nature. There are 2 types of third nature in the Kama Sutra. Women presenting third nature, who Vatsyayana asks to adopt the gentleness, the attire, the behavior of women, and at the same time live like a sex worker. So you earn your sexual pleasure through oral sex, and at the same time, you earn your business livelihood through oral sex. Okay. For man presenting third nature, Vatsyayana says, conceal your desire, be a masood. Okay, and at the same time, do all these 8 types of techniques of oral sex on your client, which is the man, and these all 8 practices are philocentric, to be honest. And then that's how you learn your living and your pleasure. Okay. Then comes the debate. Now the debate is somebody from this room will say, no, it's not a good practice. The objection is it's not a good practice. It goes against the morality of the society, and it should not be done. And if one comes in contact with, especially these women that he is talking, by the way, Vatsyayana is taking this man, woman, and third nature. Third nature is situated as feminine in juxtaposition to the man. So third nature is equivalent to women here in this debate. So what Vatsyayana is doing, and I'm arguing it in my chapter, that he is taking this social category of queer and he is putting this in the discursive paradigm of gender binary in his text. So over here, the objection is raised by these scholars, like these most likely dharma people, that it should not be done. But Vatsyayana says no, it's okay for a man who receives it from the sex worker. However, it should not be done otherwise. When he says otherwise, Vatsyayana means, and I'm now reading between the lines, and based on my understanding of how ideology is working in that time period, purity is the concern, and anxiety comes from impurity. And semen is seen as one of the pollutant in the body, out of filth pollutants. And if somebody comes in contact with semen sperm, then it gets it may affect their morality. Anyway, then Vatsyayana says no, it's okay with sex work, right? And he lists four of instances to add nuances to this problem. That look, people from this region, they do oral. They don't do oral sex. People from these regions are quite open about this. And if you see on this slide, I know it's again an overwhelmingly slide. The last verse is saying, in these moments of sexual intimacy or sexual union, women is pure, women's mouth is pure. So Vatsyayana is trying to challenge or confront the dharmic people or these scholars with the textual authority. So he's not saying by himself, but he is putting these two authorities in front of each other. And then he says, okay, since there is no consensus among on how to see oral sex, what conduct is right, because there are so many different ways people perform it. So follow the regional conventions, what your regions say about it, and most importantly, one's own lifestyle, one's own belief system. And then he adds further instances in the form of verses, like men performing on men, men performing on women, and then certain men who don't perform it at all. And then there is a statement that even if a practice is said in the text, doesn't mean it's applicable to everybody. And that he shows in the next verse, the dog meat analogy. And that's what my argument in my chapter or in my dissertation, that this dog meat analogy is the intertextual moment where he is saying, look, in these dharmic books that you consider as the holy or pure books, they say there were times when this guy called Vamadeva, he ate the dog meat in order to survive his life. So there is not one universal fixed rule applicable to everybody. You need to see these rules in their regional context, most importantly, time, place, occasion, the lifestyle, and the belief system of the person. It's like the commonsensical thing that you would say. If I say, no, it's wrong, and you would say, no, Shubham, it's not wrong. You need to understand the consequence of the nuances and then the consequences. And I'm like, okay, I'll take a step back. So that's what his settled thesis is. Before doing all these practices, consider all these things, especially the conventions of your region. And this was the shift that, and I was discussing it with my supervisory committee, that this is the shift that is coming in the first, or I would say second millennium, second century of the Common Era, when they're talking about regional customs in this manner. So what I'm trying to argue over here, because Rachel showed me her hand, so I need to finish this by now. So what I'm trying to argue is Vatsyayana engages in the debate on oral sex to normalize its practice for non-procreative, non-heterosexual bodies, which the dharmic morality does not approve of. And why does he engage in this debate like the way he does? So Vatsyayana's intention is not to challenge the discourse of dharma, because dharma is the overarching paradigm. It's like if I'm staying with my parents, I'm taking money from them, food from them. I respect them, but at the same time, it's my own autonomy. I need my own space too, right? If my parents are saying you have to do this, do this, do this, I respect it. But I have my own choices. I have my own intentions. So that's what he is doing in the second point. However, throughout the Kama Sutra, Vatsyayana speaks for the autonomy of Kama. I respect your rules and regulations, but also I have my own life. So he is trying to make a balance in dharma and kama here. He appears to legitimize the practice through presenting selective instances from the dharma tradition. Now, why he is doing this? The stakes are high, I would say. There are some practices which he completely dismisses. He says, okay, don't do this because dharma people say this. Or he remains silent in some practices. But in this particular one, oral 6.1, he engages in like almost 19 verses with all these statements, and he's making good points. Why? Normalizing the practice of oral sex against the stream of the dharmic morality involves high risk. And why? The other point is important issue, integrating sexuality and social conduct of the third nature in the ideological and authoritative genre. If he just dismisses this debate, then authoritatively, her nature is out from this Kama Shastra domain or discourse. So while other religious and ideological discourses taxonomizes sexual deviance or deformity to exclude them from their discourses, most importantly, Buddhism, Jainism, and of course, dharmic texts, they keep them out, they taxonomize them in order to see their deformity and say, oh, you are not allowed to be ordained in the monastery, or you're not allowed to be an ascetic. But Vatsyayana does in order to include them in this discourse of pleasure and gives them a social identity and most importantly, occupation. However, having said that, there are so many ambiguities and discontinuities in the text that I am mentioning as challenge that I'm not able to make sense of. I'll be honest about that. And I'm not trying to portray Vatsyayana as some hero figure that who changed the world of erotics. No, these are these points that I'm trying to make sense of in order to see how he was playing with this idea of or theorizing this idea for society at large.
That's it.
Pleasure. I really hope my theorization doesn't change your perspective on pleasure. You still enjoy the way you do.
And now we know more loopholes.
Oh yeah. That's what I'm trying to do here.
Everybody wants the loopholes. All right, so I'll just let the two of you speak openly and freely, and I'll intervene if necessary. But probably won't be necessary because I've met Catherine and I know intervening with her is never going to be necessary.
Okay.
So look at this picture up there. Obviously, this big woman is me, and this small guy is Shubham. But it really should be reversed. You must have got this out of some comic book, maybe with a feminist tinge to it. So I really am the little person here. He's the Guruji. He's the one who's thought.
That's such a big
He's thought about this text, and I've only had a few days to think about it. So just reverse that big image up there. Make me feel better anyway. Okay. You know, I used to have a copy of the Kama Sutra, but when I went to look for it this week, I couldn't find it. It was long gone. So I don't know if that's a function of my age or who knows, but it's one of those books that's just disappeared. But this has become so interesting thinking about Shubham's work that I've been studying his slides and those comments and those quotes, and now I really want to go back and read this book because I think that this Vatsyayana is a really interesting thinker. You know, you can pick dull thinkers, and maybe you think the whole Sanskrit learned tradition is dull, but there are really interesting thinkers within it, and good for you. I mean, of course, anybody could pick up this work and say, what an interesting thing to work on. But when you have a really good thinker that makes you, think about tradition and Sanskrit categories and, just so many things, aside, of course, from pleasure, it's a good place to have a thesis. The more sophisticated the thinker, in a sense, the more rewarding the thesis will become, and the more rewarding the book will be as it gets out there into the larger world. So I want to begin, Shubham, by asking you really, how did you get to Vatsyayana? How did you get into this topic?
Oh,
What propelled you in this direction?
I should write a second book on my biography then in order to answer, but I'll answer.
You'll do that someday.
Yeah. Right. So first thing about this picture is from a manuscript from the 19th century, which is preserved in the Oxford Library. And the sad part about this manuscript is, okay, you see not dirty picture here, but there are some picture where are paintings that are showing sexual intercourse, explicit sexual intercourse. And the person who owned this book, the manuscript, chopped the manuscript. And that was the first thing I was like, what the hell you have done to the manuscript? So I was really mad. In 2019, when I saw this manuscript, I was like, no. Second thing.
Thank God those pictures aren't there today.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you for your generous comments. So I was in my 10th grade. 10th grade means 10th standard in India. Divyani and Arvind might know this thing, but I failed Sanskrit, I failed history, I failed economics, and I promised myself, and I came home and I said to my mother, Mama, I'm not going to study Sanskrit or history ever. So here I am doing these things. What happened to me in 2010 and 13, I lost my grandmothers, paternal and maternal grandmothers, and I was reading Bhagavad Gita for them during the last phase of life, and they were about to leave us. And when I was reading Bhagavad Gita, I realized I'm not reading for them, rather I'm reading it for myself. And the question, this query of who am I? Because this, what is happening to them is going to happen to me too and to my parents. So am I preparing myself for that? Maybe yes, maybe not. So I was reading the Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavad Gita is the philosophical text on this existence, like who you are not, and what's afterlife. So I did as Paul mentioned, I did finish my bachelor's, but when I was doing my bachelor's, I did a diploma course in Bhagavad Gita from Department of Philosophy, Kurukshetra University, the same university, and I got quite intrigued by it. So far so good. I told my mother that I want to quit engineering right now in 2013, and she said, no, just finish your engineering, and then if you want to write about all these things, write later. But for a middle class North Indian guy, it's like a norm that you become an engineer. Okay. Or a lawyer or a doctor, but I was like, no, I hate blood, so I'm happy I should have. So in 2015, 2016, I was working as a computer science engineer in a good government organization. One day I had this revelation that, okay, enough. I have done so much of C, Java thing. Now I want to move on with my life because I was already writing about Bhagavad Gita and I presented in a few conferences in Bali and in Harvard. So it was quite well received, to be honest. And I thought, why not to make it a career? So one fine day, I wrote my resignation letter. I didn't ask my mother, I didn't tell my parents anything. So that's the best advice I'll give to everybody who's thinking of switching their career. Don't ask their parents, just do it. And afterwards, I called my mother. Mom, I'm resigning and I'm gonna come home. She's like, you better come home. I was like, okay, I came and they both were sitting in front of me and questioning me. Okay, so what after this? And what do you want to do? Like, why did you quit? And so on and so forth. I was like, don't worry, I have secured an admission in master's in Nalanda University in Buddhist Studies, Philosophy and Comparative Religions. So I'll do something with my life. So my mom was quite comfortable. Like she's like, she had like trust in me, just like Paul and Rachel, they have trust in me. So my mom had trust in me. My father was questioning, how will you earn if you're learning Sanskrit? Because Sanskrit learning language is not seen as like that prestigious or financially stable job. So my father was like asking me real life questions. And I was like, give me 2 years and then we'll decide. And here I am discussing my life with you. So yeah, that's my long story short.
So now I think it's time to get to the heart of this matter, which is oral sex.
Sure, why not?
So I am interested why you focused on this. Was it just for our talk today because it would titillate us a bit? Or is it really at the heart of what Vatsyayana is trying to do? So, and especially this issue of the debate.
That's an interesting question. Quite the contrary, I would say. If you're reading this text and you're thinking of oral sex afterwards, you'll not be titillated at all. Rather, you'll be like, I'm off. There are three moments in the there are three moments in the entire text where Vatsyayana is engaging in serious arguments, and that sort of reasoning I would call as case-based reasoning. The first one he does in the first book of the Kama Sutra, where he advocates women reading Kama Sutra. The norm in classical South Asian literature and scholars have discussed so much, especially from feminist perspective, that women didn't have right to learn or read. So the objection comes from scholar. They say women should not read the text, but he says no. Women should read the text because they learn the practice this manner. So this is the first time he engages where we see his explicit point of view, his voice, and we try to contextualize this. Second one is about female orgasm, and he goes into the nitty-gritty of like how they feel pleasure, how it's important for women to equally feel pleasure during sexual intercourse. And third one was this oral sex. So I would say my only reason of picking this one is, and I'm discussing women too, but I was thinking of how he is trying to integrate queer identity into this larger domain of Kama Shastra, while other ideological discourses, they are shunning them out or they are removing from their discourses, like Buddhism and Jainism. Is it answer?
Well, except we don't know what the texts were before him. Afterwards, one could make this statement.
That's true. That's true. And he's quite pedantic with his citations. When he's saying his, by the way, if anybody wants to learn how to do a literature review, ask Vatsyayana. Vatsyayana is quite formal and he is like, okay, this scholar says this. When I say scholar, I mean his predecessor. Predecessor A said this, predecessor B said this, predecessor C said this, but I am saying this thing. Just like we do in our literature review, or some of us have already done it, sorry. But the point over here is, if his predecessors have mentioned that thing, he would mention that thing that, say, predecessor C has already included third nature in this discourse. So I'm gonna just go with the flow. But if he has to take this time out in order to bring to introduce third nature here in this book, and at the same time he has to engage this in this long debate on oral sex, the chances are unlikely that somebody has already did it before him. So based on the structure and the style of his argumentation, I'm making this claim. But again, I'm not trying to portray him as heroic, but there are some challenges that I'm facing with textual tradition itself.
So as I struggled for a few days, not much, to understand this, I didn't see so much a focus on third sex. True, it's there right at the beginning of 2.9.
Right.
Okay, so it is emphasized because of that.
Right.
But there's so much discussion of heterosexual context as well.
Right.
So I'm wondering if his purpose is really to create an exception to the general concept of norm. So much of Indian intellectual thought and ethical thought goes by the way of a general norm And then you carve out exceptions, okay? So if family life is to be the norm, then you get asceticism early in life or late in life
Right.
as exceptions.
Right.
So if oral sex is something that is shared by way of being human in many different contexts, isn't his interest broader? Are you narrowing this too quickly, perhaps?
That's a very good question. I mean, if I take a moment to think about it, I'll be quick. So if we see the counter argument there, we see that he is not saying that it's okay to have oral sex with third nature. He's saying it's okay to have oral sex with sex worker. And this is one of the points that I feel why he's not using third nature when he actually started the chapter with third nature. Just simply say it's okay with third nature and move on. But no, he's not doing that. When it comes to sex workers, or Vaishya to be precise in Sanskrit, the idea is the main subject of Kama Sutra or Kama Shastra is Vaishya, a sex worker. And there lies the pleasure. So the purpose of having sexual intercourse or sexual intimacy with a sex worker is to enjoy, to have pleasure, to have sukha. But I would say I'll take a note of that question and I'll try to answer it deeper in my analysis. I may not have an answer right now, Catherine, but
it's tease me, because
it's a general concern.
Because you were highlighting the third sex as his main interest,
right?
And then I see the sex worker, then I see the people of different regions,
right?
And then you see the relationship with women. So, and I saw he was doing something different. So, how does he hold the norm and the exception together? I think he softens the norm because he says that only the really important people, okay, your top administrators, it's not everyone in the elite, the three upper castes,
right,
Vijjas, so to speak. There's a lot more variety there. So he's restricting the breadth of dharma in its strict sense to a subset of those people. Okay, so that's interesting. That's quite different from other things that I generally read.
Right.
And then he seems to include many, many different groups. And in the end, he comes down to all the variables. Now, these are the variables, I would think, that are the exception variables. So some general principles, but not so heavy.
Right.
And then a number of subsets here.
Right. So when Catherine is saying exception, it's like the dog meat and then emphatic answer. So if you read the dog meat, I'm sorry, Catherine, I'm taking over here. If you read the dog meat analogy, it's like even a dog meat is prescribed in the Ayurvedic text, then who eats it? So it's a rhetorical question again. But then in the next verse, he emphatically responds, of course, there are men, of course, there are places and times when these practices are not useless. So although it's a weakest possible endorsement, but exception is there as Catherine is pointing. And so I thought I'll point out where Catherine is pointing out.
So the underlying question then is, how much does he hold to dharma? Is he a bit innovative, if not revolutionary even there? And how does he open up these other topics for consideration? And how inclusive is he? Because ultimately he comes down to what your own desire for pleasure, what your own pleasure is, what your own desire is. And that made me think of the four categories of the Purusharthas, and the four authorities, which is Shruti, Smriti, Achara, and Atmatushti.
Right.
So this is the Atmatushti category.
Interesting.
Okay, so it's always interesting how there are all these paradigms around, because the Indian method of thinking is to classify and to define, to classify, to order, and so forth. So I find that Atmatushti, ultimately it comes down to you within some framework of modified dharma and some openness now to pleasure, to various groups.
Right.
That'll have to be the last question before we go to the broader discussion, but please do respond.
No, I would say he is definitely doing something innovative here. How revolutionary, I'm not sure about it. And as you pointed out, I'll recheck my analysis. And the point of Atmatushti, Atmatushti means pleasure for one's own self. Because he is talking about like how you feel about yourself. So I didn't consider that point until now. So I would say thanks, Catherine, for mentioning that. Karma and Atmatushti, I'll see if some literature is already on that. So thank you so much for mentioning.
Thank you. So stick around. Thank you for that. An opportunity to have a broader conversation, and those of you who are watching via I'm trying not to ignore you, I promise. Those of you who are online, please do send your questions to Scott, and Scott will articulate them for you. Who in the room would like to ask a question? Go ahead. You got one though.
Okay. Okay. I had one written, like I was thinking of one, and now I have four, so I have only one. And
Tomorrow
it was such a fascinating presentation. Shubham knows that, I was not feeling well and stuff, but now this presentation and before that some yoga just really helped me. So my one question would be, the moderator is super strict. So tagging off to from Catherine's question, how does Vatsayana reconcile calm or pleasure with the other constraints on female purity and caste purity that exists in other texts, and maybe temporarily able-bodiedness?
That's a good question. Temporary bodiedness. Since I mentioned it's a discourse.
Non-disability.
Disability, yes. It's a discourse. So gender is there. Like when we say when we see gender, social genders are there, but in his text he's using discursive gender. Who is the male protagonist, or who could be the male protagonist, or who should be the male protagonist, and who could be the female protagonist. So third nature is put in the female protagonist. So you see the discursive gender binary there. So that point one. Caste, Vatsayana doesn't mention caste at all. And there is no caste hierarchy. Yes, there is class hierarchy. If you talk about elite strata of the society, mediocre, and the outcasts, or you can say the lower ones, and then in that. So his prime focus, based on my reading and understanding the cultural context of, say, 3rd century of the Common Era, I would say it's focused on elitism, elite class. Caste is not discussed there. At one point, only one statement he makes is like, you have to work according to your own profession, which is like, if you are a Brahmin, you earn through sacrifices. If you are a king, then you earn by governing. If you're a minister, then you earn by being the counsel of the king. And if you are a tradesman, then you earn through. He just briefly and cursorily mentions that, that's all. So no caste system there. What was your first point before caste?
Female sexual purity, and then disabled.
So disabled is not there. In my very limited reading of the Kama Sutra, although I'm reading it all day, every day, kind of thing. And,
super limited.
Yes, but everybody should have Kama Sutra. It should have like this Kama Sutra in their library, personal library. Female, yes, he is a big advocate of females, like female learning the Kama Sutra, Purity, not so much, because purity is the concern of dharma text, and he is not touching dharma on that front. It's like, I'm not gonna bother you unless you bother me kind of situation. So he's trying to be very sensitive, shrewd, clever in that sense. I'm not going to penetrate your domain, but give me at least some autonomy for my own sake. And he is doing politely, in my understanding of it. Or maybe I'm overreading it, so that could be a thing. So.
Emmanuel and then Francis, and then John.
So I thank you for the talk. It's really fun. But what I like the most is the idea that we're discussing people who have written. I'm very impressed with the lit review that you showed us, like the tiny little thing. But what I'm really interested in is people have written to categorize. And it made me think about mitzvahs. Because, you know, in Jewish life, you organize life around certain obligation or commandments. And part of them are basically, they have two words. One is what you should do, right, and what you shouldn't do. Right. Ase and Tase. And there are about 240 that you should do, like study the Torah, right, read the Talmud, things like this, teach it, you know, and then things you shouldn't do, like eating pork. And what I find fascinating in your talk is when you discuss these categories and the taxonomies. Mm-hmm. And I want to ask you, what's that tradition and what should we make of this when we think about those texts? If they have, in a way, the same goal, which is to kind of regulates purity or religious behavior, or what are these categories?
Loaded question, I would say.
Created for? Where do they come from, and what do they do to us?
Where do they come from? Because texts before Kama Sutra are lost, so it's most likely that these taxonomies and classifications and these terminologies are coming from his predecessors. So nothing with surety can be said about that, to be honest with you, Emmanuel. But at the same time, purity is not the concern here. The only concern in this entire book is your interpersonal communication. How you put it in this manner. This text is less about how you perform it, it's more about how you talk and think about it. So these taxonomies, these classifications, even the 8 ways of kissing, 8 ways of embracing, 8 ways of say oral sex, they are technical terms that which if you are performing it, actually you will not use it, but you know these terms back in your head. So it's like, no, some people say it's for that time of sex education. I'll not repeat that and I'll not say it because I'm not sure about that. Regulate, yes, but regulate in a way that you are performing it, you are adopting it, that's becoming your second nature, you're learning it. So I don't know if I've answered your question.
To codify one slide.
Yeah, to codify like to make it as a norm, part of the norm. So if you talk about should and should nots, that's more of a dharma and artha thing. Here, if shoulds and should nots are there, it's more about what you should do and what you should not do in terms of pleasure, in terms of when it comes to performing sex. And it's okay. Performing sex is only one particular section of this book. The rest is about how sex workers earn money. Like that's the second largest book, and that's the, I would say, soul of this entire Kama Sutra. How sex workers earn money, how they evaluate, like whether I'm earning from this client or earning from that client. So these are the technical terms that this text is giving. Codes, yes, but terminologies in order to think about it, to make some profit out of it. Not just a monetary profit, but sexual profit. How to have picnics, how to have parties at home, how to be at salon, how to present yourself, how to decorate your house, how your bed sheet should be, what should be on the bedside tables, all these things.
Okay, thank you. I feel that we've only had a tiny little snippet of what you have to say, and I wish we had much more time to listen. I was wondering about your title, The History of Pleasure. I'm wondering what changes, what processes happen between the Kama Sutra and the 16th century and later texts. I think I'm wondering if there's an evolution in the discourse of pleasure and its relationship to other transformations, the transformations in art, in the theory of imagination, and also the development of Tantra. The idea of the left-handed Tantra sex.
Yeah, so I would say beautiful question. I was expecting somebody to ask, so Francis, you are. Thank you so much for that. So if we see later texts, there is so much of evolution. These authors, let's say 11, like if you see on the screen, which I'm sure you won't be able to, but 11th, 12th century Nagara Sarva, so third in the series, you will see how this particular author is taking poetry from 8th century poetry. It's called Kuttani Mata, like the discourse of the sex worker matriarch and how she is preparing younger ones, giving advice on how to be with their clients. So he is taking that particular snippet from that 1,000-verse long poetry, and then he codifies it in a manner that becomes instructions. So you can see how these interactions were happening, like how these Kama writers are taking from poetry, as you said, Tantra, and in later Kama Shastra texts, aphrodisiac, how to use magic, how to subdue, how to which we quote unquote sometimes call black magic because of some 19th century, 20th century forces that we know of. But at the same time, these remedies, herbal remedies were at play. So later scholars, they were doing some sort of innovation that I would say, especially Nagara Sarvasva and then Shringara Deepika. So Shringara Deepika is theorizing the I would say stages of love. So they're not only 10 stages of love, but 11 stages of love, which we see in the Bhakti tradition, especially 14th and 15th century, I would say. And in South India, around 12th century, there is this text by Chandraraja, Madana Tilaka. It's written in Kannada, not Sanskrit. In Kannada. It's the language of Karnataka. He is saying that whatever all these Kama Shastra scholars have said before me, they are all fraud. I'm going to bring the new knowledge. So there were always this anxiety of bringing innovation, newness to the domain. And I would say those pioneering scholarship which have shunned this tradition and said Kama Sutra is the only text and rest are just the mere imitations of the Kama Sutra, I would say no, that's wrong. That we need to change the way we look at these texts. They are bringing innovation in their own context.
Could I just ask another question related to Francis's before we go to John's question, which is, if you think about the social and political changes that are occurring during the changes you're seeing in the Kama Shastra, what would be the most important ones?
I would say two important ones. One, as you said, about Tantra. So Kama Shastra is one intellectual domain. Tantra is another domain.
Could you give a 2-sentence definition for that? Because people might not know. You have 3 sentences.
Okay, no, I'm not worried about sentences. I'm wondering how to explain that because I've never thought until now how to explain Tantra. So Tantra is a system of or school that uses alternate means to achieve liberation, and tantric practices are usually seen as opposite to what dharmic practices are. So it's another paradigm for achieving liberation and higher consciousness. And there are 2 types of Tantra, broadly speaking, and I'm no authority on Tantra, but still there are lower level Tantras and higher level Tantras that talk about philosophy of self and the divine, but in different manners. So these recipes, these subjugation tricks, techniques, they are coming in Kama Shastra, and these scholars who are writing and say on the onset of, I would say, second millennium, they started taking these techniques from tantric tradition and also from poetry. Poetry also influenced Kama Shastra, this genre of writing, but at the same time, Kama Shastra also influenced poetry. So it's like bi-directional. So if we see the cultural history of Kama Shastra, we see like how these interactions between poets and theorists are happening.
Thank you. John?
I may have as many questions as Devyani.
No one has as many questions as Devyani.
But I'll resist. So I think one question will be super easy, and you'll say, can answer it in one word, and that is, Moksha Shastra has not been mentioned at all, and I'm guessing that that's because it's simply regarded as irrelevant to the Kama Shastra tradition.
I'll answer that definitely, okay. But it's a relevant question.
Okay, so so maybe it's not a one-sentence answer. The real question I want to ask, because it's so rich for us, is that most of us in the West, because we come with certain configurations of the category religion, are likely to think that we are only talking about religion when we're either talking about Dharma Shastra, but perhaps not even then, only when we're talking about moksha, escape from the cycle of reincarnation. But that's my Western bias that I bring with me. Is that bias in any way relevant here? Might this in some sense be counted as religious? And if so, by what definition of religion could this text be considered as a religious text, if at all?
Awesome. So, big question, good question. Thank you so much, John. To answer your first question and go to this moksha thing. So earlier there were three aims: dharma, artha, and kama. Moksha came, I would say, slightly later. I would say first century of the Common Era, and Patrick Oliver has written so much about it. And moksha is dharma and moksha, they are irrelevant to kama. That's for sure. And Vatsyayana's aim is not to re-theorize what dharma has said. No, that's not his domain.
Moksha means liberation.
Moksha means liberation. Thank you. So that's one. So the shift was happening around first century or so. What was your second question? I think I forgot. Religion. Whenever I'm teaching or whenever I'm discussing with somebody, I say Hinduism is not a religion. So what I would like to call it, system of thought or school of thought or tradition. Tradition, I would say, is the precise term. When we think about Hinduism, it's an amalgamation of multiple traditions. Although we are given this term Hinduism for so many different forces, I would say. But that's not the legit term. It's a blanket term for somebody to explain, okay, I come from Hinduism, or you come from Hinduism, or they come from Hinduism. But even in Hinduism, there are multiple traditions, like of Vishnu, which is Vaishnavism, of Shiva, which is Shaivism, of Advaita Vedanta, and so on and so forth. So if you ask me, my personal opinion would be tradition, school of thought, way of living, system, ideology, discourses.
In which kama is essential.
Kama is one of the strand, I would say.
I just wanted to make sure you answered what I think was underneath John's question, which is, if you had to answer the question this way, what does studying the Kama Sutra tell us about religion? Is that, yeah?
Oh, okay. What does...
I know him pretty well.
Okay. So I would say, no, that's not his concern, to answer in one sentence. But third text, Nagara Sarvasva, if you see in the last chapter of Nagara Sarvasva, which is 38th chapter, he says, if somebody wants to have a baby boy, then they have to do these practices. And I know I asked Rachel this question, and she was like, what are you asking me, Shubham? So there are two schools mentioned, or two religions are mentioned. One is Buddhist. If you are a Buddhist, give donations to the Buddhist monks or Buddhist monastery, worship Tara, which is Buddhist deity, and then follow these mantras, which are Buddhist mantras. And if you are non-Buddhist, Tirthaka most likely in that time of Nepal, around 11th or 12th century, were Hindus, I'm sorry, when I say Tirthaka, I mean Vaishnavas or Shaiva, like Shaivites, or these Brahmanical forces that were at play, or that these traditions were at play. So we see religion later, not so much. Throughout Kama Shastra, this tradition, I have not come across religion question, or like they are not discussing religion. That's not very relevant to them, other than the third text, Nagara Sarvasva.
Sorry, I think there's a definitional issue here, and just to avoid making John ask another question. So by the time Tantrism begins to influence the Kama Shastra, you have an interest in the impact or the possible role of sexual activity, physical activity,
Right.
in a kind of a moksha experience. So if we were thinking of something like religion being somehow related to moksha, to liberation, then it seems like at that point one can see more obviously the connection between religion and pleasure. Or not.
In one word, I would say not. The entire genre, I would say it will be like a big answer to say, but I would say no, I haven't come across religion in that sense, or as you said, like there is a gap that I'm not able to understand the question.
We can tease it up more tomorrow. Do we have time for? No, we don't. Okay, those of you who are fellows at the center, we'll meet tomorrow at 11 o'clock to tease out more of Shubham's extremely interesting lecture. And next week, not next week, the 23rd of January. Is that right? What week?
Do you want to announce, Scott?
Yeah.
Well, people can't see me, but the scheduled lecture for next week is on the board. There's some question as to whether or not we may move that lecture. We'll announce that tomorrow. And then there's just a heads up of the following week, which you should put on your calendars as well, a special lecture.
And that's happening in a different room in Hickman 110. All right, stay tuned, everybody. Thanks very much, Shubham.
Thank you so much.